So welcome to Autonomous Menstrual Management, Taking Charge in the Post-Roe Age. My name is Nicole, and I have built this lecture to hopefully help us in the months to come. The first thing that I have to say here is this content is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your primary care physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition. This is very important to understand. I am just sharing information. This is purely educational, and I am not a doctor. So take everything in this lecture and then do your own research. I'm going to be starting with the connection between aphrodisiacs and abortives. So I wanted to frame this lecture as making us kind of start at the root when it comes to fertility control. And that means understanding that it is actually an ancient practice, probably been a part of human culture since kind of forever. So let's talk about that. Fertility regulation is as old as time. First thing we need to realize is that we've been taught a lot of myths about ancestors and what their lives were like, in particular about being perpetually pregnant. This is something that you'll hear, that the ancestors, they were constantly pregnant, they couldn't control their fertility, they just reproduced endlessly. And although their close-knit communities had more resources for those who wanted to become parents and pregnancy was encouraged culturally, there are still many reasons why, people would have wanted this knowledge of self-mastery. And so we also need to realize that our narrative of progress is skewed because we're kind of taught about the fight for modern forms of fertility control. And so we erase the fact that people of virtually all cultures and historical periods have employed some form of fertility regulation. And there are many reasons for this. Preventing birth has always been necessary for lots of different reasons. So I've listed some here, including age, unwillingness to bring children into a hostile environment like famines or plagues, or peonage or war, beliefs regarding numerological, astrological, or other religious conditions, financial reasons, and more. So the point here is that fertility regulation is not new at all. It was purposefully de-skilled. Anne Koblitz is an author who writes, most women will employ some form of birth control at some point in their lives, even if the cultural values of their society encourage the production of as many children as possible. So again, driving home the idea that we have always been to whatever, our culture allowed, whatever we knew, we were always managing our fertility. Now, when I first started studying herbalism, and particularly herbalism that is connected to fertility control, or, just fertility in general, like labor and birth and things like that, I realized that many of the abortifacient herbs were listed as aphrodisiacs, which I thought was very interesting. So after doing more research, I realized that the ancients knew how to use herbs so that they could enjoy their sexuality without worry of pregnancy. So the connection between abortifications or amenagogues and aphrodisiacs, or, herbs that make you horny, is obvious. So love and sex can be fully enjoyed when both people are empowered and in control of their fertility. So there are lots of examples of this in Antiquity, like silphium is one of the oldest herbs known in medical texts for being an abortifacient, as well as mistletoe, moringa, mugwort, dongquai, and even black seed from black seed oil, which is an herb that's, I guess, popular at the moment. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about what those methods of fertility control actually were. So the methods that were used to control fertility in antiquity are diverse and expansive. The herbs that were used were obviously they were what was found around them, so they can be found all over the world. There's so many different examples. There's actually a lot there if you get into the research. So the earliest documentation of abortifications goes back over 4,000 years in both Chinese and Egyptian medical texts. And it's likely that the Egyptians were controlling their fertility by using leaves of the acacia shrub. Herbs are the most popular form of ancient fertility control when you see what evidence is there, and include herbs like silphium, parsley, acacia, pennyroyal, tansy, artemisia or mugwort, the cohoches, slippery elm, cottonroot, and others. So these are just a small fraction of what was used. For example, indigenous tribes of North America would have used over 100 different medicinal herbs to produce menstruation. And it's likely that since the Neolithic period, when people began to keep domestic animals, that these cultures observed the fertility rituals of the animals themselves. So when a livestock animal would give birth, they would go and eat a certain plant after giving birth to help them expel the afterbirth or their placenta. And so we can sort of infer that when people started keeping domestic animals, at least 12,000 years, probably much longer, they learned about the abortifacient properties of certain plants through witnessing animal birth. There's important things to understand about how the ancients controlled their fertility. There are different conditions than there are today, so this has to be acknowledged when we talk about it. The first is that they understood the menstrual and lunar cycle, so they had more of an awareness and a connection with the natural rhythm of the moon, and also that the female body had this rhythm that matched it in a way. So they use a variety of different methods, and it's important to know that these methods were just available by healers and midwives until the labor crisis of the Middle Ages due to the plague. So up until that point, basically, you could just go to a midwife or a healer and they would, dispense to you the dosage and what herbs you needed. So in antiquity, both pre- and postcoital methods were used, but postcoital methods were more common across cultures. So what you'll find is somewhere between after having the sex and the next expected menstruation, that window there is sort of where people were working with the body to encourage a bleed. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more in depth in this lecture. One or more forms of fertility control were utilized to either stop fertilization, like different kinds of barriers were used, seaweed, beeswax. There's lots of different ways that they sort of avoided fertilization from even happening by not allowing the egg and sperm to meet, or they interrupted the implantation, which is what you see with herbal abortives or contraceptives, and that occurs about a week later, a week after the ovulation occurs, is when the implantation of the fertilized egg is going to happen. So that's kind of the key time for them. Now, how reproductive autonomy became criminalized is also important to this story, and it really sets up why abortion is the way it is in America in modernity. So we'll start with the plague, because it created a labor crisis in Europe, which incentivized control over reproduction. The witch trials, which came after this, are part of the historical degradation of fertility knowledge in Europe. But then those ideas about why it was bad for women to control their own fertility, these ideas spread to the Americas and elsewhere, reinforcing gender roles of a certain kind, reinforcing reproductive relations between people out of the time. And so the essence of the witch trials were not about individual witches and what they were accused of, but it was about how rapidly social relations were changing at the time. So women's particular knowledge of the natural world was needed to be demonized in order for this political project to take place. And so midwives and other healers were then condemned and delegitimized and slandered and killed. And so in the wake of the plague, which killed a huge, portion of the European population, and with the development of nation states, so the idea of a strong population and your country, and the transition from a feudalist economy to a capitalist economy, all of this was of particular interest to the ruling class to increase the population of human beings. And so control over fertility was imperative to that goal, that political project. And so this continues to manifest itself through the American system of chattel slavery. It's one of the major drivers of the primitive accumulation of wealth under the capitalist system. So you can see how like all this is all happening together. Sylvia Federici writes in Caliban and the Witch that the criminalization of contraception expropriated women from this knowledge that had been transmitted from generation to generation, giving them some autonomy with respect to childbirth. It appears that in some cases this knowledge was not lost, but was only driven underground. By denying women's control over their bodies, the state deprived them of the most fundamental condition for physical and psychological integrity and degraded maternity to the status of forced labor, in addition to confining women to reproductive work in a way unknown in previous societies. Here I'm going to start to switch gears. And I wanted to talk about rejecting the hierarchy of contraception versus abortion. So even though contraception has largely become the dominant paradigm regarding fertility control in modernity, some people who menstruate will still prefer abortion. So why? Abortion is safe when it's carried out correctly. It's utilized less frequently than contraceptives, which must be used every day and have, adverse health effects. To maintain privacy and control over their fertility choices, which can be a matter of their safety, and sometimes to exercise a less costly option. So Margaret Sanger and the origins of the modern birth control movement are actually responsible for this false hierarchy, because Sanger did not champion abortion and contraception equally. She actually believed that birth control would eliminate abortion, and so this is not how it happened, and abortion is still necessary, right? So the focus has become about fertility control pre-conception, but that's actually, in a way, exacerbated a taboo around abortion and the right to end a pregnancy at your will and for no other reason. And so many early forms of fertility control, if we go back to Antiquity, they occurred post-conception in early pregnancy, but they weren't viewed that way socially. In fact, the pregnancy wasn't even seen to exist until quickening, or until the fetus could actually be felt kicking and moving inside. So everything before that, if you didn't show and if the fetus wasn't moving, basically they considered it just a way to regain your menstrual cycle. So you can see that, the social relations have changed quite a bit since then, but we know that in terms of herbal contraception and abortion, there's an overlap. Sort of a gray area where we're talking about contraception, we're also talking about releasing and implantation. So I just wanted to explain that and just kind of think outside the box when it comes to the difference between contraception and abortion, and kind of why we need both to be existing, fortified, and accessible. So if you're just joining, this is a live lecture that I am doing on my YouTube channel. My name is Nicole, and my YouTube channel is accessible by clicking the link in my bio and clicking YouTube. It'll take you to my channel, and you can follow the visual resources of this lecture. The lecture will also be posted on to YouTube after it is finished. If you're just joining us, thank you for being here. I'm just going to take a sip of water, and then we'll get back into it. Now I'm going to talk about the history of abortion in America, starting with Roe. So in January 22nd of 1973, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Roe v. Wade that a pregnant person has the constitutional right to an abortion under their right to privacy. Legal was defined as up until the point of fetal viability, which was around 28 weeks, or the beginning of trimester 3, or at any time if the pregnancy posed a threat to their health. Effectively, Roe struck down all state abortion bans. That's why it's important. And this ranged widely. So before Roe, there was all kinds of different laws from state to state. Some completely legal to have an abortion, some completely illegal, and everything in between. This basically struck down all of any kind of ban and made it legal federally. But we have to realize that the backlash to this ruling was immediate. So the Hyde Amendment occurs only 3 years later, and it was the most successful backlash because it made it illegal for Medicaid to cover any abortions that were not life-saving, quote. Now further amended with a sexual assault exception. So what this did was it barred poor people from obtaining abortions because of cost. Other restrictions were also able to be placed, like mandatory waiting periods, gestational bans, requirements on where abortion could be performed, parental notification requirements, and rules requiring permission from a husband to terminate. Fast forward to 1992, and you have Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which is when the Supreme Court ruled that states cannot ban abortion outright in the first trimester, but they can put laws in place that are meant to, quote, protect health and well-being. In the second trimester, restrictions can be more involved and must balance the rights of the pregnant person and woman with the fetus. And then in the third trimester, abortion is only allowed in cases that protect the health of the person carrying. So Planned Parenthood versus Casey is important because it led to the current trimester system and the idea that the restrictions cannot place an undue burden. And what that means is that one's ability to obtain the abortion is hindered if there's an undue burden. So the backlash to undue burden included all kinds of experimental state laws like parental notification and consent requirements for minors, mandatory waiting periods, and other ways to delay or disrupt obtaining an abortion. And so after congressional and state legislature changes in 2011, several types of model legislation that was guided by anti-abortion groups passed. And it passed primarily in red states and areas with a lack of clinic access. These are things that you might have heard of already, like the 20-week abortion ban, 6-week heartbeat bill, bans on dilation and evacuation in the second trimester, mandatory waiting periods, medical abortion bans, mandates on doctors having relationships with certain hospitals, which, the hospitals refuse to work with them and then the clinic can't run. The goal of all of this is for the abortion groups to bring one of those bills to the Supreme Court. And if they have the right majority, they'll be able to then overturn Roe. So that immediately means that states can ban abortion once again. And that's what's at stake right now. And that's what I think we should just be preparing for what happens afterwards. So that's a lot of what I'll be talking about next. They eventually want the Constitution amended to ratify fetal personhood, and that would just ban abortion and contraception potentially federally. So this is the current climate of what we're up against, and now we need to talk about what happens when Roe is overturned. No longer an if situation. So there are 5 scenarios to this. There are 4 scenarios that are likely and one that is less likely but still possible. So the first scenario, a case makes it to the Supreme Court and Roe is overturned. And so once overturned, certain state laws could go into effect immediately, and that would make abortion illegal in that state. The second is that the Supreme Court will rule that there is still a constitutional right to an abortion, but instead the standard from viability, as it once was, will now change to fetal pain. And so it'll be argued that fetal pain begins very early in the pregnancy, and thereby it effectively bans abortion outright. So that's the second strategy. The third is that states will pass other restrictive laws short of an outright ban, like trying to get more and more extreme, as we saw in Texas, and the Supreme Court refuses to hear any cases involving any of those. So that would leave those laws in place, if they aren't able to be challenged. And then the fourth is that the Supreme Court rules that there is still a constitutional right to an abortion, but clinics and doctors are not obligated to perform the procedure. This makes it so logistically difficult to run clinics that they can't function or provide services. So those 4 scenarios are the most likely way that this is going to go down. But there's also the 5th scenario, which is that the court hears an abortion case and decides that the 14th Amendment guarantees a right to life for all. And so that outweighs the right of privacy. That was the previous precedent with Roe, and this makes abortion illegal everywhere. So it's least likely because of how drastically it would change the country and result in its own kinds of unintended backlash. And now this doesn't mean it's not a possible outcome, but it's just to show you that other covert methods have proved very effective for anti-abortion advocates. Now, every state has different laws, and abortion access today is already limited. So in the visual resource here on YouTube, you can see that the West Coast and East Coast are really the places with the most access, and the rest of the country already has big gaps. But if Roe is overturned, you'll see that the map even gets more sparse, and abortion becomes vastly less accessible. How to find the best abortion provider. So I want you to know that Planned Parenthood is not the only abortion provider, and that they provide less than half of all abortions. So there are plenty of places that you can go that are not Planned Parenthood. You can go to www.ineedana.com, which is a safe, secure resource for finding providers in your area and provides resources for financial assistance, lodging assistance, and more. It's best to use a VPN, a public computer, a private browser, and to clear your web cache afterwards. Telemedicine abortion is available currently in Colorado, Georgia, Hawaii, Illinois, Iowa, Maine, Maryland, DC, Minnesota, Montana, New Mexico, New York, Oregon, and Washington. So that means if you are trying to obtain an abortion today in any of these states I've just listed, you can do so without being seen in person. You can access telemedicine and have the pills mailed to you. If you're in a state that requires in-person counseling or ultrasounds, you can also consider a neighboring state where this is not required. I'm going to talk about how to avoid crisis pregnancy centers, which are fake clinics that trick people by claiming that they're providing medical care and social services so they can dissuade people from seeking abortions. They prey on low-income and marginalized peoples, offering free pregnancy tests and counseling. They also purport very dangerous lies about abortion and can compromise your health, privacy, and safety. So the last thing that you want to do is end up in one of these establishments. So before you visit an abortion provider, head over to reproaction.org/fake clinic database. And what you'll find there is a list of all the crisis pregnancy centers that they have investigated so far. So you can cross-check and make sure that you are not accidentally entering one. Now I'm going to talk about body literacy and how it's key to autonomous menstrual management. So when I say autonomous menstrual management, I'm talking about, if you break it down, autonomous, meaning you have control on your own, menstrual, having to do with your menstrual cycle, and management, managing it for your ends and purposes, controlling your own fate and future. This all begins with the menstrual cycle, and obviously I have a lot of resources that are much more in-depth than what I'll be going over here today, but I wanted to go over the basics of the cycle so that you can understand more about how to utilize methods of abortion properly. So one thing to look at here is the menstrual phase. There's two main phases to the menstrual cycle, with ovulation being the turning point between the two of them. So the follicular phase or the pre-ovulatory phase, ovulation, and then the luteal phase or the post-ovulatory phase is the second half of the cycle. And as you can see, there's the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle occurring at the same time. The ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle are both responding to the hormonal changes. So the hormonal cycle graph here is important because you can see that the pre-ovulatory, the follicular phase, is dominated by the hormone estrogen. It creates the cervical fluid, it helps build the uterine lining up, and it helps mature the egg to ready it for ovulation. And then in the luteal phase, after ovulation, after the egg has popped out, you have an increase in progesterone, and progesterone is important for thickening the uterine lining and making it hospitable for a potentially fertilized egg. And it will also rise for about 2 weeks before falling. And the fall of progesterone, when progesterone gets low, as you can see at the end of this graph, the walls of the uterus fall, and this produces menstruation. So what's really important about fertility awareness is that you learn to identify when you're fertile. So you're only fertile during the fertile window, which is the days that you have cervical fluid present leading up to ovulation, and then ovulation itself.
the rest of the menstrual cycle, you're not capable of becoming pregnant. So I teach the Symptothermal Method because we learn to identify when your fertility begins and ends, and basically how to avoid pregnancy just through the timing and understanding the biomarkers of when, fertility is possible. And then ovulation occurs, and you have about 2 weeks until the next expected menstruation, meaning that after ovulation occurs, there's a fixed window before the next menstruation, and it's about 2 weeks long. So if you continue to not bleed for more than 2 weeks or 18 days, we would, basically be able to see a pregnancy right in the fertility chart. So I encourage you to learn more about fertility awareness in this way, because you'll be able to start to wield your reproductive choices with more confidence. And when we talk about emergency contraception, it's important to understand how this works. So, in a regular old menstrual cycle, I've marked off here in this chart that you have both pre-ovulatory and post-ovulatory natural infertility. And this varies, again, depending on the person's biomarkers. This is my own chart that you're looking at here. But during those times, there is no chance of pregnancy anyway. The only chance of pregnancy, again, is in the fertile window. So, reasonably, the only time that emergency contraception is really working is during the fertile window. And this is because it contains a high dose of contraceptive, levonorgestrel, and it's able to suppress the spike in luteinizing hormone. And luteinizing hormone's purpose is to dissolve the follicle that the egg has been incubating in and maturing in, and it creates a little hole, and then that's actually how the egg pops out. So LH, or luteinizing hormone, is essential to the egg releasing. So what the purpose of emergency contraception is to bring that luteinizing hormone down and prevent the egg release and delay the egg release, and that's hopefully how the pregnancy is going to be prevented, by the egg actually not being there. So, because fertility begins around 6 days before ovulation, when you produce cervical fluid, you're only going to want to use Plan B basically before LH surges, before luteinizing hormone is actually there helping the egg pop out. So you actually have a very small window of the days that Plan B is going to be effective. So Plan B would be effective at the beginning of the fertile window, but once the egg is already on its way out and LH is already high, at that point, this emergency contraception is not going to interfere with the implantation. So if the egg does pop out and it does meet with the sperm, the Plan B really actually hasn't done anything. And lots of people take Plan B and think, oh, it worked, but actually they were just in their natural infertility phase. So they never got pregnant in the first place, not because the egg didn't pop out, but because it wasn't during the fertile window and it wasn't when the egg was even available. So you have to understand sort of the context of how to use emergency contraception properly. There's also the weight issue with emergency contraception. It seems like it loses some of its effectiveness when the person weighs more than 155 pounds. They aren't totally sure why. I'm not sure why the standard dosage is the way it is. Maybe it should be higher. Not totally sure. But another thing to keep in mind is that it still works. It just works less effectively at that weight or higher. And lastly, there was a lot of talk about hoarding emergency contraception, but emergency contraception has a shelf life of 3 to 4 years, so make sure to redistribute if you do buy extra for yourself or others, because they will not last forever. If you want to access emergency contraception online, you can go to afterpill.com. So hormonal birth control, obviously it's a tool to prevent pregnancy, but it can still fail. And birth control pills can be used like emergency contraception if it calls for it, if you don't have access to emergency contraceptive pills. But you need to use levonorgestrel specifically. So there's only certain pills that can do this. You may or may not have access to them. Here I put small way to figure out how to compute the pills that you would need to take of regular birth control, levonorgestrel, and how you would make that equivalent to a Plan B dose. And that may be useful to you, but always remember that hormonal birth control, which is what emergency contraception is, has serious side effects, like including blood clots. So please, if you notice any severe leg pain, shortness of breath, or symptoms of stroke or heart attack, go to the hospital, tell them that you use birth control or emergency contraceptives, and hopefully they can get you medical care immediately. But that's not something to mess around with at all if you do, experience that. But it's on the rare side than normal, but I would say it's probably happening more than is being reported. So last thing here is LARCs, which stand for long-acting reversible contraceptives like implants and IUDs. These are also not a solution to the abortion crisis, just like hoarding Plan B is not a solution. They're difficult or impossible to remove, so yeah, you might have trouble getting them out. And they come with lots of side effects that may be undesirable, and this is what causes high rates of discontinuation. So if you are choosing them, just be aware that they may not be as long acting as you wish them to be, because you may start suffering from using them. So just be aware that you want to be choosing forms of contraception that are right for you because they're right for you, and not because of the political climate, and especially not because of fear. And a lot of things can kind of go wrong with that. So just wanted to make everyone aware of that. If those are your choices, just be, informed consent, understand what's going on. Now, how to take power in the luteal phase. So there's no pregnancy possible in the pre-ovulatory phase because there's no egg yet. So the first half of the cycle is not necessarily as important as the second when we talk about how to control one's own fertility. So if you take hormonal contraceptives, you likely aren't having an ovulation or hormone cycling, so this won't really apply in the same way that it does to someone who is having a typical menstrual cycle. But the post-ovulatory phase is called the luteal phase. That's what happens after ovulation, but before the next menstruation. And so this time is the key to intervene if a pregnancy is possible, but you want to bleed. So that leads us to self-managed abortion and what your options are. So the first is the best way to avoid pregnancy is to avoid ejaculate in the vaginal canal when you are fertile. But if this happens, hopefully you understand your menstrual cycle a bit and you know this, and so you can take action immediately. So you have several options for disrupting the implantation and bleeding on time. That includes herbal spermicide, herbal contraceptives or abortives, menstrual extraction, medical abortion with pills, and manual vacuum aspiration, or what's sometimes called surgical abortion, although it's not surgical in the way that you think. Now, why might we want to use herbs instead of pharmaceuticals? There's a lot of reasons people choose this that are not for fear-based reasons. So these are just a few of them. Herbs work with the body. They're freely available in nature. They're found all over the world. They connect people to their culture. And they often have more broad spectrum action while also not suppressing ovulation, which is important to long-term health. So there are lots of herbs to avoid pregnancy, but I just want to make clear what the difference was between contraceptives and abortifications. Basically, herbal contraceptives are different from pharmaceutical contraceptives in that they don't prevent ovulation, as we were just saying, but they help you avoid pregnancy by interrupting the ability for the sperm to meet with the egg. And then herbal abortifications help you end a pregnancy by interrupting the ability for the pregnancy to continue through a number of different actions on the body. Now, they have overlaps because they can be utilized at the same time, which is the 2 weeks after ovulation, but before a missed menstruation. Now, for herbal contraception, these are just kind of two routes that you would go down. Topical would be one. Neem oil is well known as a spermicide and motility reducer, as well as Indian soapberry oil that's used intravaginally, either before or immediately after. But neither of these are known to disrupt the natural lactobacilli in the vagina. Of course, if they do, discontinue using them for you, because everyone is different. And then for the oral route, you may want to choose the implantation inhibitors. The most common are Queen Anne's lace tincture or cotton root bark tincture, but you need to be consistent from every day after the sex that occurred or the ovulation up until the next menstruation. So you want to basically increase the dosage until you come up on your next expected bleed. And juniper root and rue are other alternatives. And I'll get into this a little bit more. There's 5 classes of herbal abortifications: implantation inhibitors, estrogenics, antispasmodics, uterine contracting herbs, and also gastrointestinal irritation. So I'll just give you a quick overview. This is from actually a previous webinar of mine where I talk about all of this in much more depth, so you can head over to that afterwards and it'll give you much more info on all of this. But implantation inhibitors, I enjoy these because they interfere with progesterone by blocking progesterone receptors, and this causes a bleed to occur. The estrogenic herbs, they work because they interfere with progesterone. There needs to be a balance between estrogen and progesterone, and when estrogen is very high, this disrupts progesterone's levels, so thereby causing a bleed. But avoid if you have history of problems with estrogen. The antispasmodic herbs work by relaxing the uterus and inhibiting blood flow and softening and dilating the cervix. And lastly, the uterine contracting herbs cause uterine contractions. These, have different actions depending on which chemicals are in the herbs, but oxytocics and thujones are the most common. And then gastrointestinal irritation herbs. Basically, by irritating the GI tract, you stimulate oxytocin, and the same thing applies. I also wanted to comment on a few things that you see if you start to look into herbal abortion online or something. So I just wanted to clear up what I know about these methods. So vitamin C is often purported to be used through online resources to disrupt implantation and produce a bleed. Now, this likely stems from cultural knowledge of the abortifacient properties of unripe fruits, especially papaya and pineapple. This is known in South Asia, and if you have friends or family that are from this area, they may know, older especially, they may know something about this. Now, the diverse phytochemical properties of these foods may have played a role in addition to just vitamin C, and therefore vitamin C pills from the store are not a recommended way to use vitamin C in this instance, because there's the potential for kidney stones and other health concerns with overusing vitamins. It's really taxing on your liver and your kidneys and your filter systems. So instead, I would always opt for kind of what tradition would do. So this is to actually just eat the unripe whole fruit. And this was just interesting about women in Sri Lanka who use papaya fruit as a contraceptive, and how they would induce abortion by eating papaya for 3 consecutive days, and that there may be an enzyme which suppresses progesterone in the fruit. And sometimes people eat the seeds as well. So this is just to show that, yes, there's a seed of truth there, that vitamin C and unripe fruits, would have this action. But if you just buy vitamin C pills at the store, you're not going to get the same action. Thankfully, in the US, a lot of pineapples that are coming into the store, for instance, they're probably unripe. So you would have basically kitchen access to this herb. The next one I wanted to talk about is pennyroyal, because it also comes up when people talk about herbal abortion. They have this, what I'm calling botanophobia, which is irrational fear of plants. Because pennyroyal is in the mint family. It has a really long history of use as an emmenagogue and an abortifacient, and it's been used by many cultures. You don't want to use this herb if you have had kidney disease, and you don't want to use the oil of the herb. So you'll have a hard time finding pennyroyal oil because herbalists know that it can be lethal. But many herbs, many oils, essential oils of herbs can be lethal. For instance, thyme, another kitchen herb, just like mint, If you concentrate the oil and then drink it, yes, it could be fatal. Pennyroyal in particular, it can be fatal to use the oil. This is why you will not see the oil being sold. So when people kind of talk about pennyroyal and get really freaked out and start saying, oh my God, how can you recommend this to people? It could be dangerous. It's very unlikely that this person is going to come up on some pennyroyal oil. I will always teach people to avoid the oil, but I also have a balanced view of pennyroyal, and it's not toxic in tincture or tea, which is why you'll find pennyroyal in different herb shops and things. It is a GI irritation herb, which can be more unstable than other forms. So I tend to use more of the implantation inhibitors than GI irritation herbs, but many people use pennyroyal alone as a simple, as they say, without the use of other herbs as an abortifacient. Now I'm going to talk about one of my faves, Queen Anne's lace, Daucus carota, or wild carrot. The advantages of Queen Anne's lace is that it grows wild everywhere. The seeds can just be eaten directly, like you don't have to extract it in a tincture or a tea necessarily, although it will work well in those forms. And it's an anti-progesterone herb so that it, prevents implantation. It can be estrogenic, so it's not indicated if you have estrogen issues, which there are many estrogen-based issues. And if you are foraging for it, it can be confused with a lethally toxic plant. So unfortunately, it has a poisonous cousin that we don't want people to get confused. And so I'm going to give you a crash course in how to identify Queen Anne's lace properly, because it is so abundant and you probably could have it in your herbal apothecary. You just need to know how to be sure of the identification. So the first thing to look at with Queen Anne's lace, if you think you see it, is look at the stem. If it is hairy and green, it's Queen Anne's lace. If it is smooth and has purple dots, it's hemlock. So big difference. Like you can obviously see the left versus the right picture here. Queen Anne's lace will be very hairy. The flower head of Queen Anne's lace is flat, and it also has a red flower in the center, a little drop red flower in the center, whereas hemlock has a rounded head and it does not have a red flower in the center. And the most obvious way to tell the difference is the seeds. And the seeds are what we use for the abortifacient properties. So really you're going to be looking at it when it looks more like this, when it's dried and has, the plant has died. So it's about to expel its seeds. So you can see that the head curls on Queen Anne's lace and the seeds are very thorny. So you can see that they have like those lots of spikes on them. Whereas hemlock does not necessarily curl inwards. It can sometimes, but it's not going to curl inwards in, this sort of concave shape the way that Queen Anne's lace is. And the seeds are smooth, so you don't see any spikes, 0 spikes on the hemlock seed. So for me, that's the biggest difference. If I see the thorns, the hairy stem, these, and all green, I'm pretty much sure that this is Queen Anne's. This is important. Only harvest and consume an herb if you're 100% sure you've identified it correctly. I mean this seriously, though. It's very important. And if you are not confident, there are other people who will help you and provide you with what you need. You can find Queen Anne's lace from other sources rather than foraging it. I just believe because it is so widespread in North America, in Europe, in lots of parts of the world, it's naturalized, so it's available, put it that way. When it comes to utilizing alternative forms of fertility control, you really need to have your tools already in place in your toolbox. That means body literacy. You have a basic understanding of your menstrual cycle. Best if you understand when you ovulate and when you're fertile, not just when you menstruate, but having any understanding of your menstrual cycle is important. And then secondly, herbs on hand. Choose what you plan to use and have it available instead of, needing to obtain it while you're pregnant and need it. So herbs require patience and consistency. They don't work like a pharmaceutical. They are medicine, but they don't have the same pharmacology as pills do. So you need to pay attention to your body and to your regimen. You need to give yourself time. Try not to get anxious. Execute your plan and also have a plan B know what you're going to do if herbal abortion fails, because not all are successful. The body sometimes really wants to hold on, and that's, something to sort of behold about the body. But if you want to know more information in depth about kind of how to use this information of your cycle to help time how you use herbs, you can check out my webinar, Integrating Herbalist Practice with Fertility Awareness. That's on my channel as well. So now I'm going to switch gears here and talk about abortion with pills, and how they work differently than contraceptives. So there's two pills typically talked about. The first is called mifepristone, which lowers progesterone. Just like Queen Anne's lace, it's sort of like an anti-progesterone. And when progesterone falls, this causes the uterine lining to become unstable and menstruation occurs. So it's taken first orally in the 2-pill regimen, and it has a very high rate of success when used before 11 weeks. And then the second is misoprostol, which causes uterine contractions and softens the cervix, which results in menstruation. It's typically taken second, either orally or vaginally in a 2-pill regimen, or if mifepristone is not available, misoprostol is used alone at about 85% effectiveness when used before 11 weeks. Now, if you need to access these pills, you can go to plancpills.org, put in your state, and you can learn more about where you can find it and how much it costs. Now, right now, abortion is legal in the United States, so abortion pills are approved medications, but how people get the pills can affect your risk of being prosecuted. So I wanted you to know this as well. At least 24 people have been arrested and prosecuted for self-managing their abortion. And so if you do choose to use abortion pills on your own, you don't have to tell anyone that you took them. Say you even need to go to the hospital for some reason, there's no way for them to know whether you took them, so you don't have to volunteer that information. Many people just say they're having a miscarriage. Some people also might want to use VPNs and other technology to protect their privacy, depending on what state they're accessing the pills from. If you want more help with the legal side of things, you can go to reprolegalhelpline.org. There are other creative ways to get a hold of these pills if there are restrictions in your state. So I've listed them here. I'm not going to go over all the specifics right now, but the first creative way is to use a mail forwarding service. Basically, sign up for a mail forwarding service, do a consultation in a state that has telemedicine or online medicine, and then you're going to use a different shipping address and then have that mail forwarding service basically forward to your actual address. So there's, more cost associated with this. You also have to have valid ID. There's definitely restrictions to using mail forwarding, but it's one creative way to access the pills. The second way is to use telehealth in a neighboring state that does telehealth abortions, and then pick up from a clinic in a neighboring state. You can also ask friends who live in that state if they can have the pills shipped to their address, and then you can pick it up from them. The third way to creatively access these pills if there are restrictions is to use what's called general delivery to a border town. So you'd look up, the state that's next to you that has this abortion access, and then you would have the pills sent via general delivery mail. Not all post offices do this, so you need to call the post office in the border town that you wish to drive to, and basically that post office will accept your mail as long as you have a valid ID that you can pick up the mail with, that matches what's on the mail parcel, and then you'll be able to drive to the border town and pick up your package. There's also menstrual extraction. So this is a bit different from abortion with pills, more typical to sort of a clinical sort of abortion technique. But instead, it's practiced at home as a healthcare technique. So it helps remove the uterine lining with a cannula and through suction, and this can be used whether or not an egg has been fertilized. Basically, people use this sometimes to just clear out the menses quickly. And this was performed by groups of people before Roe put in more, protection for abortion, clinical abortion providers. So there's some things that you need, basically an antiseptic, a speculum. You need this Delum, which is menstrual extraction equipment. And much of it can be sourced, medical supply companies. There's ways to access this device, but you may need to make it yourself. And a few other things that, will make menstrual extraction more comfortable. The biggest risk of doing menstrual extraction at home is infection, because sterilization is really important when we talk about anything going inside the cervix and the uterus. You have to be really quite extreme with making sure that it is a sterile environment. But it can be done outside of a clinical setting. So if you want to learn more about menstrual extraction, if you think that menstrual extraction is something you might be interested in doing or working with in the future, or if you're a birth worker and this is a service you would think about providing, you can go to womenshealthinwomenshands.com/pdf/menstrual extraction. So there's more information about how exactly to do this. I also wanted to include information about past trimester 1, because most abortion is occurring in the first trimester, but there's a variety of reasons, again, why this may not occur, and it's pretty much because of stigma and taboo that people don't talk about abortion past trimester 1. So if you have limited access to abortion and you're past trimester 1, you can use the same medications that are used for medication abortion. And this requires more time, more medication, and definitely like a support person depending on how far along you are. This requires 1 dose of mifepristone, waiting 36 hours, and then taking misoprostol every 3 hours until the abortion is complete. And this method would likely be able to end a pregnancy at any gestation. So if your only options are using medication or attempting some sort of invasive procedure outside of a clinical setting that you're not confident about, this is the best and safest option. So I just wanted to make you aware of this. I'm also really big proponent of pre and post-abortion care, because we kind of talk about it in terms of, well, we should have the right to it, yes, but we should also have the right to, comprehensive health care. And so that really gets left out when we talk about abortion. So herbs are really your allies no matter which method you utilize. I think the antispasmodics and antiprogesterone herbs will help make abortion more comfortable, even if they fail as a primary method. So, even if you use the herbs for 2 or 3 weeks, they don't function as you hoped, and you opt for medical abortion instead, you take the pills. Hopefully the goal is that by using the herbs, you will have an easier time with the expulsion, because the herbs have already prepped the body for what you're trying to do, and the medication just puts you, over the edge. It just sort of forces the body more, and this, is a good thing. So we want to make the experience, as comfortable as possible. Don't work if you have to. Really, honestly, have someone help you if you're open to it, like have someone there. I think it can be really helpful. But you may choose to be alone, and that's fine too. Mental preparation, journaling, and just a belief in yourself that what you're doing is the right choice for you. These are all important strategies to sort of be in the right mental space to release an implantation. And then similarly afterwards, you need to know first that there are, necessary emergency care after abortion that you may need. Your uterus may be giving you signs that something isn't right. And so if that is the case, you should feel free to seek emergency care. But we don't have many rituals which support the rest and recovery period after abortion. And abortion is very normal, but it's still invasive in certain ways. And so we can benefit from awareness of what to expect and what could be good afterwards to help you recover, get your menstrual cycle back, get your hormones functioning well, and continue to have control over the whole process of your menstrual life. So there are lots of different herbs that are useful after abortion. I actually have a really long post on this on my Patreon blog with lots of details. But some of the herbs you can use are the nervines, antidepressants, adaptogens, astringents, hormone balancing herbs, tonifying herbs, antispasmodics, and then also herbs to stop bleeding or spotting afterwards, because sometimes people will continue to bleed for a long time, like in small amounts, and sometimes you just like want that bleed to stop, and herbs can be really useful for this. So there's a ton, but yarrow, mugwort, rosemary, lemon balm, lavender, and St. John's wort are some of my favorites for caring for people after an abortion. Now, I wanted to end on this note. Can we get in trouble for sharing this information? Yes, absolutely. Some people already are. So in 39 states, it's against the law to perform an abortion if you're not a doctor. In other states, you still must be a medical professional. In New York, you can do your own abortion in the first 2 trimesters, but only if following the advice of a medical doctor. And some states still have laws on the books that make it a crime to help someone with a self-induced abortion. So in Post-Roe, just know that the first people who will be arrested are those who are trying to provide extra legal abortion services. And this obviously puts people working on this issue in increased danger. So just remember that all the information that I am sharing here is for informational purposes only. Lastly, I wanted to just talk a little bit about surveillance and strengthening abortion networks. You want to avoid electronic and paper trails when possible, but this may not be possible because we don't live in that world anymore. So if you do use electronic devices, centralize it to one device that can be encrypted, like your phone. You want to encrypt your phone so your data is not readable. Apple already is, so if you have an Apple product, it already is encrypted. In Android, you need to go to settings to encrypt your phone. You also want to lock your phone with a passcode. And if you need to communicate with someone about this, you might want to use an encrypted messenger, such as the Signal app, to organize yourself and get yourself together for the support that you need. Lastly, fertility awareness journals can be useful instead of period trackers. I've looked at pretty much every period tracker on the market. Each and every one of them says they will comply with a subpoena or a court order that requires them to give your data to the state. So if push comes to shove, I'm expecting that all of everyone's menstrual data that they're putting into their apps is going to be fair game for prosecuting people. So if you must keep your period tracker and you understand this, you definitely want to lie to it about the date of menstruation. So if you do find out you're pregnant, basically you're going to mark as if it was a menstruation and just keep it looking like typical. So that is just another way to avoid surveillance. Now, this webinar is pulled together from lots of different resources, but these are 4 of the best that I can give you today. So the first is Handbook for Post-Roe America by Robin Marty. Great book, very useful, lots of info. Sex, Herbs, and Birth Control is really about history, but it will help set you up to understand, what people have done throughout the ages to control their fertility. And then Herbal Abortion, The Fruit of the Tree of Knowledge by Uni M. Tiamat. This is an older text that has been very useful with lots of information about different herbs and how they function, dosages, and things like that. And then Please Bleed by Samantha Zipporah, Plants and Practical Magic. So these are just a few resources that can give you more specifics than I could get into tonight. As well as my own resources, I just want to make available to you. I have a podcast with lots of different topics. I also have a course that was just released in December called Breaking Up with Birth Control. This is a good choice for someone who's really been struggling with birth control and is looking for some other alternative way of managing their fertility. I also have my Patreon, which has hundreds of blogs on it now, lots of blog content about specifics. You can scroll through my Patreon and see if any of the blogs are of interest to you. Lots of protocols in there, lots of more specific things that I'm not comfortable necessarily sharing publicly for certain reasons. So I keep a lot of specific protocols in there. And then we also have the Learn Body Literacy Discord group. So we've started organizing on Discord to connect with others and to talk about various menstrual issues. I also have a few books that I have written now and charting journals. If you do find that you want to move away from digital period trackers or digital fertility awareness apps, you can chart your fertility completely analog in a journal. And lastly, if you want to connect with me, I'm Learn Body Lit now on both Twitter and Instagram. And my website is learnbodyliteracy.com, where you can access more of my services, such as the group program, which is starting in March. It's a 4-month course where we go over lots of different aspects of fertility awareness, but basically introducing you to the method and how it works, and what it might be used for. And I also am offering single sessions. So if you have specific issues and you need someone to kind of go over all of the details with you, and also to help you create a regimen for yourself to move forward on your journey, whatever that is, I hope to help you with that as well.